I just want to introduce the lead of our next Fireside Chat, who's Ashley Fairman, who's the founder and CEO of Dice Cyber, which is a veteran-owned, we're talking veteran here, cybersecurity firm. You know, FedGeoDay, it has geo in the name, but let's face it, we want to talk about the important technologies, whether it's cyber or AI or things that really make our life worth living. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to set up our panel and, not panel, this nice fireside chat. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Yeah. Is that one on? No. All right. Yes.
It should be on.
Okay. Thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that. And thank you, Carla, for the invitation. And honestly, we're here to bring the doom. When we said people are optimistic, we're here to tell you don't be. So cybersecurity, I'm just going to be real. And in cybersecurity, it's all about risk management and understanding what we're doing. And so today, I have pulled out rock stars of my Rolodex. I've been in cybersecurity for multiple decades, and I am so fortunate that Damian Taylor, he is joining us from the USPS. He is the Chief Information Security Officer for the OIG. And we have known each other for multiple decades and served together in the military and in Iraq. And thank you so much for joining us today. Next, I have Jennifer. And Jennifer, when it comes to supply chain risk management, she brought that to the world. She brought that to the forefront. She talked about it before anybody else even knew what that was. Literally coming into conversations when we met distinguished leaders here in the United States, advising the presidency. I met you when we were working with Obama's staff at the time, and supply chain risk management wasn't a thing until when a ship went crooked in the Suez Canal, and people are like, oh, shit. Am I allowed to say that in a Govy talk? Yes. People were like, oh, shit. How am I going to get my car? It messed up supply chain for 3 years on getting cars in the United States. So when we talk about supply chain risk management, we're going to be talking about it from the digital perspective and how cybersecurity is a key player in that. So please take a seat. Yeah, I'll sit next to you. I'm not scared. All right. So first, I want to kick it off by asking a more generalized question of, from your perspective, and this is why I picked them, is because they are so different and have such diverse experience that this is really going to be a fun conversation. So to you, what does resiliency mean when we talk about cybersecurity and open source systems?
So one, thanks for having me, and thanks for not mentioning the number of years we've known each other. I think from a resilience standpoint, and as Ashley mentioned, having spoken about risk in the extended supply chain, which means not just the company that you are buying data from or some sort of a hard good, but who they're doing business with, and then who those people are doing business with. Resiliency is really being able to either get back up quickly when you get knocked down, and or preempt the disruption that is going to occur. And I think we can all agree, no matter where we sit in this room, disruption's going to occur. And so when we think of open source, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to listen to the last panel, there's so much, and you probably are going to talk to this, there's so much that we just don't know where it's coming from, which makes it really hard. And so when I'm thinking about resilience, anything that can be marked or documented or stamped or validated, we should be getting ahead of that. And it's simply the cost of doing business anymore. And I don't care if you're doing business with the government or you're doing business in the private sector, the ripple effect that occurs that keeps us from being able to get back up when we're knocked down or preempt the risk to have true resilience exists. And that's what we need to get ahead of when we think about resilience.
Thank you. Damian?
Yeah, I think for me, so she mentioned getting knocked down and getting back up, right? So I think of an analogy. I used to be a boxer in my younger years, and everybody has a boxing plan until you get punched in the nose, right? It doesn't feel good, it hurts. So from a cybersecurity perspective, is you want to have some level of defense in depth, right? So you don't want to depend on one solution, whether it's a firewall, an endpoint security product, whatever you want to think of from a protection measure. Look at your home, right? Yes, you have locks on the doors. Do you have security cameras? That's another level. Do you have a gun? I'm a gun owner, so if you make it in my house, you're probably not going to make it out.
Thank you for
So
that.
it's one of those things, right? So we approach this as multiple levels to allow you to fail at certain levels, but then also to get back up after you get punched in the face. So that's the way we approach it from a cybersecurity perspective.
Thank you. That is fantastic. And so I think the theme of that was don't get punched in the face, or if you are, have a plan, right? And so I think that also goes back to our earlier discussions of like satellite resiliency. We talk about all the different assets that we have, and that's that defense in depth, is we have an asset that can provide this data, we integrate it with another system, but we don't just trust one source of data, right? We need to pull in data from multiple sources to allow that defense in depth. So next, how has cyber threats evolved throughout your career, and how has that impacted and shaped your career? We'll start with you, Damien.
Yeah, for me, it's grown from these simple little virus programs that are annoying to attacks that have agendas, right? The agendas can vary. They can be as simple somebody in their mom's basement trying to just cause havoc on a website, but then people are motivated by political and financial reasons. So the attacks have become a bit more elusive in detection. They may look like one thing, but they're actually entirely different things. And then you have these things known as state-sponsored type attacks, where a country, we all know the Russias, the Chinas, they commit a lot of resources to these attacks. They've actually formed cyber units to get after whether it's proprietary information or government secrets. So when depending on what agency you're working for or what company that you're working for, your crown jewels or the data that you hold value to, it can differ from the protection mechanism. But I will say that the attacks have become better. They've introduced AI to help, and it makes things easier for the adversary by lowering the bar to entry into some of these places that they're trying to attack.
Great, and I think it's important also to mention on that one is when we talk about supply chain attacks, who here was affected by SolarWinds and that outage that it cost the government, right? So when we talk about cyber threats, we're not just talking about physical assets, hardware, we're talking about how are those systems updated? How are they getting those patches? And that was a supply chain attack that heavily impacted our government space. Jennifer?
Well, I agree. I think, and I'm by no means a cybersecurity expert, but I think, one, a lot of you can kind of group them into a financial ramification or reputational. So if they're state-owned, we're trying to stop an operation of some sort. If you think about from a commercial standpoint, even if it's a nuisance, there's some sort of a financial impact. And I think the impact has grown, whether the mechanism or the vehicle for it to be created, the impact has grown because our supply chains have become, our business relationships have become so tightly networked. And so if you think about what happened at the beginning of COVID, where we started having all of these conversations about reshoring and nearshoring and onshoring, and all they're talking about is untangling the supply chain of who you're doing business with. And I think, as you're talking about the impact and how the evolution of the cyber impacts have occurred, I go back to the fact the reason that the ramifications and the dollar amounts have become, and the impact opportunity has been hidden so well, is because there's so many layers of business relationships that we have globally, and we can thank Amazon for all the good that's happened there. Amazon and other companies that have gone into global networks have really created that opportunity for this cyber evolution.
Great, thank you. And I think that goes back to the slide Katie had earlier when the billion-dollar incidents, and it's getting more and more expensive because we're so intertwined. So one thing that may happen over here is now spreading, and because of our integrated systems, now we don't, they're turning into billion-dollar incidents, more and more billion-dollar incidents. And so one thing I want to point to, I mentioned the SolarWinds incident, but what are some of the most recent incidents that are impacting your area, and like what is top of mind for you right now? Like this is driving the urgency when we talk about resiliency, open source data, supply chain risk management. what's really like, this is why we need to drive this forward? What's at the top of your mind, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think when I see recent examples, I'll pick one. Atlanta, last year, I believe, there was a ransomware attack where an adversary was able to compromise the Atlanta Healthcare's network, and they were able to encrypt a bunch of data. And so, like Jennifer said, that's financially motivated because they understand how hospitals work, they understand their psychology, and they know they're not going to let a human casualty occur based on a bunch of data, right? So it cost them, I think, $7 million. I don't want to quote it, but it was just above $7 million to either pay the ransom or get that data back. So impacting operations is a big deal. From a cybersecurity impact, sometimes we misknowingly impact operations. I'm a big violator of that. It wasn't intentional, it just happened because either my team was misinformed or we made some wrong decisions on deploying some controls. So
Was
I think
that in Special Operations Command, Damien? Are you going to give us a little intel?
No, what I will tell you is, and this resulted in an involuntary 1-week vacation for myself, but so I had a very small team.
Over a beer later.
Yeah, I had a very small team. I was working in Houston for a company called Landry's, casino and restaurant operator, and we were actively being attacked by a Russian adversary, and so I thought it was a good idea to roll out some controls without testing it, and ultimately my actions was worse than what the adversary was doing because I locked all the restaurants out of their payment of sale, and I cost the company probably that day for 2 hours, $60,000, right? So I got to go home for a week to think about it.
Well, and I think that's important, too, to mention that we do have the best intentions, but sometimes we cause our own denial of service because we're trying to stop that adversary from manipulating our data, manipulating our systems. And at a hospital, if we're trying to stop that adversary from getting in, it's that careful balance of how do we protect our systems but still provide that availability, right? So what brings top of mind for you?
Well, I think, and that was a great example. I think it's just changing the thought process to realize that we are all the weakest link, right? And so a lot of our focus is around, and you mentioned this earlier, is around education. And when I started the company 20 years ago, when nobody really understood supply chain risk or even that they had to worry about it, to where we are now, we all had a global fast education during COVID. I mean, I got emails from my neighbors asking if I could help them find bananas for the supermarket. I mean, It was a little bit crazy.
Who went crazy on toilet paper back then?
Exactly.
That is supply chain, right?
It is. So everybody's fluent from where they sit. But I think, Damien, you had a great example. It's like we just don't think. And so what's top of mind for us is to help folks like yourselves to make that top of mind, because wherever you sit, it's a blast radius. It's not a linear, point to point necessarily anymore, depending on what industry you're in. And only the industries that are spending a large amount of money are nailing down their supply chain, like the nuclear supply chain. We all sleep better because they map out their supply chain and they keep it very static for all the right reasons. But to your point, food, agriculture, commodities are not. And so top of mind for us is just to think, I won't say doomsday, what could go wrong, but we look at everything from nation state concerns to the hurricane patterns to infectious disease now, because we all have had to deal with it, and just realize that you are part of a larger ecosystem. Last example I'll share, and I don't know if anybody here followed the Silicon Valley Bank issue a few years ago, but I will tell you that was a Thursday night. Friday, all of my company's money was at Silicon Valley Bank. Friday morning, I went out like birds were not singing. It was very quiet. And I did not know if I was going to have a company after the weekend. The interesting thing is everybody that we dealt with came at us thinking that was a financial supply chain concern because it was a bank. But you realize the bank supports every industry you can think about. So it was a major stoppage to most of the small businesses in the United States, since you have 98% of our economy is considered small business. And that was a huge wake-up call. So really long answer to your question on what's top of mind, my mind is monkey mind, is really helping folks like your example just to realize they're part of a much larger schematic and that they do need to get ahead and think of principles like you were talking about.
And Jennifer, to your point of we are the weakest link, can you articulate what you think those blind spots are for us as the humans and how we can overcome those?
Yeah, so I think it's a really great question, and it's natural as humans. We think from where we sit. And so the evolution that we've seen in companies, and just so you have an idea, about 50% of our business is the US federal government and 50% is commercial. So another 50% of like half of the largest banks in North America all use our platform to map and monitor their global supply chains. But when we started, the CISO was the only one thinking about this because cybersecurity educated us. It's not the company you're doing business with, it's who they're doing business with and that's what we need to be thinking about, and the importance of continuous monitoring because those things change constantly. What's happened is that, and the evolution that's occurred, is that we're realizing that, and again, this is from a COVID standpoint, that the procurement organization, the purchasing, the acquiring organization is actually the first line of offense and defense. And I think that when we think about the education and how we can change the mindset, we have to realize we are one large interconnected organization, whether you're in the federal government or in the private sector, and you're impacting others, so that we need to look horizontal and not just vertical when we look at risk in our supply chain, whether it's software or you're buying hardware and commodities.
And that ties me right into my next question for Damien, because you mentioned monitoring your supply chain. So Damien, can you speak to monitoring the detection and response to when we do have a compromise or we do have how do we identify a pre-compromised system? We're trusting these platforms we're using, but what if they're on a server that's already compromised? How do we detect and respond to that?
So and it's a tough nut to crack, I will say that. So it depends. So I will say this. So
Tell me more.
depending on your organization's mission, right? Where I work, we're involved in critical infrastructure, but I know we're not the NSA, we're not holding nuclear codes. So our risk tolerance is a little different, right? So we may not have to validate that supply chain all the way out, but we do some level of validation, right? So am I buying from a trusted, approved product seller, a reseller, right? Where are they getting their hardware from? It's a hard nut to crack. I'll share one quick story. So part of my formal training was at right here in DC at the National Defense University. About 15 years ago, their network was infected. So, and I don't know why the decision was made, but the decision was made, we're gonna rip out all the servers and replace them. Well, as soon as they replaced them, they were infected again. Brand new hardware, bare metal. Well, it turns out that they bought the hardware from a black or gray market provider whose chips were infected, right? So there weren't a lot of products back then that would be able to determine whether, and they're still not today, that determines whether a chip on a board is malicious or not. So when we talk about monitoring, what I like to do is if I'm acquiring a new system or if I'm in the commercial sector and I'm in part of an acquisition, then I'm gonna isolate that system. I may even bring in a third party that specializes in security assessments, right? If I can afford it. If I can't, then I keep it isolated and maybe I put some endpoint products on there so that I can sniff the traffic to and from that endpoint or run some scanners against it. There's a number of things you can do, but just taking it and connecting a pre-compromised system without having alerts set up that can detect these things is kind of the approach I take.
Can I add something? So it's even, if I could, a step before that, right? Making sure we're buying from reputable sources.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many conversations that we've been included in where people are patting each other on the back years ago when they bought something off of eBay because of the cheap, or Amazon, or what have you, and then they're surprised when they're beaconing and calling home. And I think, exactly what you said. I wonder how much money is spent on monitoring after we buy it if we had just backed up a couple steps and just bought from reputable sources. And I know a lot around security. We've been to spend a lot of time on the Hill talking about, low cost does not mean security. Right. And so I think the more we can back up and have some sort of assurance, and when you talk about monitoring, some sort of assurance that we're actually buying from reputable sources, and it's part of, when we talk about even open source, which is one of the topics for today, or the topic for today, there was a lot of pushback when the government started asking for software bills of material. because they're like, what are you going to do with that data? But I think if we think about it, and we've seen this in the banks that we're dealing with, people are backing it up and also working with those suppliers to say, okay, are you asking the same thing from your supplier? So that we know that we're buying from organizations that have the same level of security confidence in their network of suppliers. It helps add to what you just mentioned.
I'm going to ask this. Anyone, Huawei, raise your hand. No. Larry, I know you've got, okay, we've got one. Larry, you should be raising your hand. That's a perfect example of a lessons learned over time. Was we trusted some partners, and one of those was Huawei. And what we found was that they were selling pre-compromised systems that were going back to nation states and nefarious actors. So Jennifer, can you please give us some tips and tricks and best practices on how we as managers, as we're signing contracts, what can we do, and what are some of the things that we can think about this supply chain? What's your advice?
Well, I think the first thing is if I sit in the seat of an acquiring person that has the power to do such things, the first is making sure we're buying from reputable sources. I mean, that first and foremost. And I'm not talking about whitelisting and blacklisting necessarily, although there are restricted lists of, like you said, Huawei and others that we should and shouldn't buy from that have been just proven anti-regulatory or compliance. But making sure we're buying from the validated or the folks that have the same level of security. The tougher thing, to be honest with you, and would love your thought on this as well, given from a government standpoint, I think this is a little bit harder just because of the size of the organizations, is understanding how we're using the product, software, hardware, that we're buying. Because I'm a firm believer that you don't have to, there's like a baseline of security that everything should pass, but then it's really how you're using it. And I talk about, like I said, mentioned before, the nuclear supply chain, higher level of rigor, right, than maybe the lobby of some organization where we're gonna have some sort of a Wi-Fi network. And so I think that as we're thinking of tools and tips, the first thing is reputable sources, doing some sort of assessment of the third parties, the partners, the people we're buying from, the companies we're buying from. The second is really understanding how we're using, what are we plugging it into, as you just mentioned, so that we're actually having the right level of security. And this has been a conversation going on forever. I was just on the phone yesterday with a World Wildlife Organization that's understanding from like a protein standpoint how to actually track traceability of the supply chain. And again, their level of security is going to be very different than some of the things we're going to plug into our government networks. So those, if I were to have two tips of the trade, it would really be make sure you're buying from reputable sources. And the second one is really understanding what you're using the product or software or service for so that we can back up that supply chain and get ahead of any sort of interruption.
Thank you for that. And I want to tie that back to our geo data. And so one example I want to give is when we're taking data from a phone call or there's a bridge outage or a road is closed, this significantly can impact our evacuation routes. So if a malicious actor wants to waste our time, our resources, and potentially do a secondary effect on those who are impacted by the event, whether it's placing a bomb or disrupting water, that where are you getting that data from and how are you validating it? So I did see that on an earlier slide, that the second step was validation. Where are you getting this information? How are you validating it before people's lives are on the line, right? So that's something that we need to think about. So when you mentioned about certification, compliance, what our framework in the government is NIST 853. But what if a vendor passes our audits, passes our checks? Damien, are there ways that you can address that, even though, people say audits just checking the box, but it's more than that? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, audits, there is a component of it that is compliance checkbox driven, right? Just like you have to go take a test to get your license at the DMV. You got to score a certain score. You got to perform a certain level to get that plastic card so that you can operate a motor vehicle. Now, what I will say is, if you have a true secure environment, you're looking past compliance and you're doing actual security. And what I mean by that is, do you have a system set up, staffed correctly, that can detect indicators of compromise? Do you have a framework that you follow for securing your infrastructure. And I don't mean, yes, I got my PCI or I got my FedRAMP certification. There are secure frameworks out there that you can follow that are very basic that will get you at a level of security that doesn't involve just compliance. But beyond that is you can test yourself. I can hire a third party, come in and try to attack my network and provide me with the results so that A, I can fix those things, and two, I can get my staff trained up to position us better going forward. Or you do internal audits that may be more checkbox compliant, but it also follows an established assessment protocol, which does provide some level of value.
Yeah, and so Jennifer, on that, how would you recommend that agencies work together and do that risk scoring for these vendors that they're working with? Even though we have, vendor risk management, that's kind of defined, but what is your lens on that? How do you think? Because in my opinion, I don't like just standard checking the boxes. I like thinking outside of the box, asking those tough questions. How do you recommend that agencies approach that conversation with their vendors?
So a couple things. One is I totally agree with what you just said. I think and you mentioned a minute ago, there's the validation of the data, the sources it came from, the continuous monitoring, and just having whatever your framework is within your agency to make sure that it answers the need of the level of security. So that's the first thing. The second question, when I'm talking to my suppliers or the vendors or the partners that I'm dealing with, as I mentioned, there's a level of helping folks understand, like fit for use. How am I using that data? How am I using that software? Bringing in the trust. It's actually one of the biggest challenges, and we're still working to overcome it, and I mean this in an understanding fashion. We overclassify a lot of things in the government. And in that, it keeps us from actually being able to share when there's some sort of vulnerability that we could work on better together. And I do see glimmers of that getting better, but I think we need to get past that so that we can answer the question that you just said, is how do we work together to make this better? And I apologize, it's a third reference to COVID that I'm about to do, but I think that opened up a lot of things. I mean, pre-COVID, the pharmaceutical industry really started opening up the kimono and sharing, where pharmaceuticals came from before it got put on shelves. We seem to think, and I don't want to get into a fight about this, Larry Clinton, but we seem to think, he's so happy he came today, that a lot of our supply chains are intellectual property. And I would argue that supply chain risk is not understanding your business agreement. I'm not asking how much you paid for something necessarily. I'm just wanting to understand who you're buying from. Are you keeping to the same level for that product, service, software, data that I needed, how I'm using it? Are you keeping your security to the same level of how you're bringing that to me? If you're buying it from someone else or you're creating it, it's that type of conversation we need to be able to have.
That's great. Thank you. So I wanted to talk back to who remembers the slide that had it was a bunch of code. Did that resonate with anybody, right? So when we talk about map data and open source data, it's all of those factors and all of the metadata that goes into it. And then we talked about having the disparate counties that have all these different columns, right? So that's a part of the metadata. So how can we address those consistencies or identifying the consistencies or inconsistencies? And how can we do integrations that support open source data, but in a safe way? Do you have any ideas around that, Damien?
Yeah, I think you have to know what you don't know, right? And so when we talk about open source map data with the code is available, is there a mechanism to determine if the change was malicious, if it was expected, unnecessary, improve the project at all? I'm not a map guy. I will tell you that I did development for a while, and there are sometimes unintended consequences of changes, right? And so I want to let that change bake. I want to observe it. I want to put it in a test environment if it's accessible to me. I want somebody else or some other entity to take a look at that product to make sure that the intended results are what I'm expecting from the change.
So here's a little secret. When we were in the military, Damien outranked me. And so I'm very curious of his opinion of how does our military experience and regimented approach, how do you take that into your new role in a different agency? And you did have prior experience in the government, in the commercial sector as well. So how do you approach this type of thinking and problems? Do you go back to military rigor? Like, do you balance? How do you approach these type of problems?
It's a balanced approach. So it took me a little while to make that adjustment between the military mindset and then the commercial and even the government mindset, right? There's a noticeable difference of pace, and you have to learn to be a little bit more sensitive. I wasn't so good at that sensitive part of the equation.
The fluffy part?
Yeah. So after you develop a little bit more empathy skills and you start realizing, okay, I've been involved in joint projects before. I know what it means to have all these different stakeholders in a room trying to accomplish different parts of a task where priorities levels differ, but we all have to agree on what the end goal is, right? So I've taken that part from the military, and that's not military specific. That's just general project leadership or project management. But I've taken the tenacity to run down a problem and not give up on it. There's obviously a point where you fall off the cliff, and you have to recognize when you get to that point. But I think you have the military experience that kind of gives you that get after approach, and then you also take what you grab from the commercial sector, understanding the empathy piece, how to work with different types of people, whether it's the quiet person that sits in the corner, the person who is in a meeting that talks just to talk. We've all been in those type of meetings before. So I've taken pieces of all those to get after whatever the task or mission is in front of me.
So Jennifer, can you share how you approach stakeholder management? And I think that's what Damien was getting to, is managing your stakeholders and coming from your role and advising, and when we work together, advising the administration on an education on supply chain risk management. How do you manage that relationship, and how do you suggest our audience members manage that with their stakeholders, especially the people who are writing the big checks?
I think that's a really great question, and I think the concept of governance around what we're talking about today is a bit newer, to be honest with you. And I think, to your point, when we worked together, it was a lot of education, just what is that and how big do I have to think? And I think cyber was really a wake-up call, because there are no walls, right? There are no boundaries. There is no end to this, and there's no real way at that time, because we didn't have a lot of the tools that you're talking about back then, because it was 20-some years ago. But, it was really just kind of explaining that this will happen, not could, will happen to you. And so it's changed, though. I mean, I think folks are really understanding that we're a bit beholden to those that rely on us. And I think from a governmental standpoint, a lot of the education has happened over the last 5-some years that just says, you can't just put this into a contract and make it your prime or your contractor's responsibility and just trust, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, that it's going to occur. So there's a trust and verify. I think, you mentioned a few minutes ago from a framework standpoint, really understanding, here's the framework of what good hygiene looks like. Here's, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and it depends on what the mission of the organization is, and then the business units or the organizations within that organization, what are you responsible for? And then really mapping people to it. And there becomes an accountability that occurs, and you build that into your continuous monitoring. So that was a lot of words, but so simplistically. You were talking about NASA was here earlier. NASA's been a customer of ours for 9 years across all 11 centers. It's been a huge honor to work with them. They didn't start going across all 11 of their centers. It was started in one at headquarters with their CISO and their CIO, understanding that they had to protect the systems that they were responsible for. It picked up, again, when Huawei and ZTE, they actually have a law that says that they must monitor against a couple entities named within their policy. And then it broadened. And so what we were able to do is exactly what I mentioned, work with them on what that framework looks like, whether it's 853 or 161 or 171, map to their framework, and then map people to that across the centers and make a decision chart, for lack of a better term. And that is what folks are doing in an effort to get ahead. What happens with that is when we have to give executive briefings for governance, now I can talk about how much money has been spent, whether it's headcount or systems and tools. What have we found, which is really important when we're doing executive briefings, because if you do a framework well, you will find things. But that allows us to talk to the executives to make sure that we can write the checks that you're asking about.
Yeah, I really like that. And going back to mapping it to people and identifying the people, Damien, can you share with us, how do you manage resilience or measure resilience with your teams, not only technology-wise and the resiliency of those systems, but also how do we respond to resiliency with our teams? And what if that person, I hate saying it, what if they get hit by a bus? What if they win the lotto, right? And they're like, hey, I'm out. How do we respond with resilience to those types of things?
Yeah, the approach I take is I take a look at our critical functions that we have to, and everything can't be critical, right? So we will always have primary and secondary points of contact for those critical areas of responsibilities. But also you have to step back and take a look at, okay, is my team, do they have the knowledge, skill set, training that's needed to accomplish what we need to do on a daily, monthly, quarterly, yearly basis, right? So you as a manager, leadership, you take inventory on that and you look for gaps, because there's always gaps. There's some gap somewhere. Nobody's perfect, right? And so you get after those by prioritizing what gaps need to be filled, but you also take a look at where can I make slight improvements. You don't want to boil the ocean, right? You want to make small incremental improvements and assign responsibilities to those staff members, but then also have either, whether it's a mentee or somebody junior in training that wants to make it to that next level, they're involved in that process, and you get the added benefit of, helping, shall I say, like anybody who does something and feels like they create value to the team, those are the people who stay working on the team, not the people who leave because they don't feel like they're adding value to the organization.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
You mentioned earlier as well, and falling back on your military background, the idea of red teaming really helps as well. And so the other thing that we've seen, and it's being led, for our experience, it's being much more led from the finances, so a lot of the banks that we're dealing with. But
So just giving context, red teaming is good guys pretending to be bad guys trying to break in.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And so you asked about the people aspect, but we've been talking about continuous monitoring. So treating tools like exception management, right? So I want to, because we don't have all the people and all the resources to apply 100% to everything. So understanding what's critical, mapping our tools and our processes to that. But then, to your point, making sure that we're identifying the people that if this person's on vacation one day, what's going to compensate for that? And you mentioned that earlier. I just want to bring that up again. We're seeing a lot of that happening based on compliance around where am I getting data from, where am I getting systems from. So if something changes and that person's out on vacation, we have someone else that's been trained to look at that process and make a decision.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but what I would like is for each of you to start thinking about what questions you want to ask us, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because it is not very often that we get this amazing of leaders to ask questions to. So I want you each thinking. I've got 2 more questions. So first, the question I have for both of you is, what strategic investments would you make at this time to make an impact in resiliency over the next 5 years? What would you do right now?
If I'm starting from scratch?
Any way you want to look at it, yeah.
So from a systems resiliency, I'm going to spend the money on active disaster recovery. When I say that, right, so if you're in Azure or AWS, most of those environments, especially in the Gov version, they're pretty resilient. They're up 99.999% or whatever it is But I'm going to spend money on a fallback plan so that data setting systems are live in an off, I'll call it offline, but a hot standby, if you will. I'm going to do that, but even before I get there, I'm going to invest in people. Because you can have the smartest systems, you can have the most secure and robust environment, but if you don't have good people willing to put in the work, willing to learn and continuously learn, that's where you're going to fall short. Because I can say to myself, I'm a smart, intelligent guy who knows how to do a lot of things, but I can't do it all. It's impossible for me to secure the edge, secure the inside, update things. I don't have the bandwidth to do that. So invest in your people, care about your people, and invest and prioritize systems such as backups, such as following frameworks out there that are free. The MITRE ATT&CK framework, I'm a big fan of that, because there's been a bunch of smart people that have gotten in a room and said, hey, this is how adversaries attack networks. They do this, they get a foothold, they jump over here, and then not only do they tell you how they do it, they tell you how to defend against it. And this is all free. Now, the tools to use to do it, those aren't necessarily free. But if you want to know how I protect against domain name spoofing, or how I protect against tunneling adversarial traffic through a firewall, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is one that I fall back on. There are a bunch of others, but that's my go-to. So knowing what's out there, knowing how to use it, investing in your people, and investing in good, solid, prioritized technology.
And I'm really hoping the administration a few blocks away hears, please fund the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Do not defund it. It was at risk last week, so let's hope this administration, please keep funding. So, Jennifer?
So I go after that.
No, it's so important for those free frameworks. But if you had a blank check, where would you invest the most so that our country is resilient over the next 5 years?
As far as this conference is concerned?
Yes.
Okay, so I agreed with what you just said. I look at kind of a data flow in kind of three parts. You know, what's coming in, what happens when it's here, and what's going out. And so I think incident response is kind of what's going out, like cleanup on aisle 5. I want to invest in, validating the data, as you mentioned before, and you mentioned, it's like, what's happening while it's in-house? Is it being used correctly? Did it change suddenly? Do I know why it changed? But I also want to back up the truck and make sure that I'm working with all of the providers of this open source intelligence, if that's what I'm talking about. And as I said, if it can be documented, stamped, validated, what have you, do all that before you let it in to make sure that you don't have to deal with the other two things.
So the final question, and then I'm hoping some of you have some great questions for us, is how would you recommend that we collaborate across government, academia, industry, so that we can support each other in resilience to make sure that, going back to a lot of our conversations today, that mapping data saves lives, it protects lives. How can we protect that, and how can we ensure resilience?
From my perspective, you have to lower the bar to entry, right? Because when you start talking about state and local entities, we talked about Rhode Island having one of the more robust fire systems, if you will. That's surprising to me. California, not a surprise. Number 2 to me would be Texas and New York and some of the bigger places, not Rhode Island. And I've lived in Rhode Island. But so I think you have to think about it from that perspective. Ask me the question again.
Yeah, let me look at the question again. How would you, the collaboration across industry, what do you recommend that the collaboration can do and support resiliency together?
Yeah, I mean, here's a collaborative environment, right? We have multiple folks. Some of it's, I came from North Carolina, but I would argue most of you guys are probably here within the DMV. You have to lower the bar to entry. So a state and local entity, they're not going to have a IT sec team. The state probably will, but my hometown of Fayetteville, North Carolina, there's probably 1 or 2 guys or people that work in IT security, and they probably were...
Probably not even IT security. They're just IT that have an additional hat of, oh, you're securing us. Here's a firewall. Now you can protect us.
Yeah, so you make opportunities, right? We don't want... You're not going to get the state and local participation if the conference is $5,000 to attend. They're not going to fund that, right? So you need to make these small, more intimate sessions where people are more able to open up and share information. One of the places, and Ashley spoke in, I've been to a few, called B-Sides, right? They have them in different cities. So now I don't have to worry about traveling from Tampa to DC or from Tampa to San Diego. There's a B-Side in these different cities that maybe I just need to go 15 minutes down the road to
It's a
attend.
free cybersecurity conference. So whatever town you're in, look it up, BSIDES, and you can attend and learn things that you didn't know you needed to be scared of.
Yeah, and and you take I'll call it vendor fatigue, not to, cast a negative light, but if you've ever been to some of these larger IT-centric conferences, there are a ton of vendors. Rightly so, they pay for it through sponsorship, so they should be there. But as a practitioner in this space, I get approached by vendors no less than 10 times a day via email, phone calls, IMs, whatever flavor you want to mention. From that perspective, you want to go to a place where it's like you're going to a counselor's office where you can open up and share things that you're not worried about being judged. You're not worried about being sold on something. You're there to gain information and to share information in these groups. So, folks can participate in these different conferences, or if it's something that's a large conference that does cost money, fight for it through your leadership. Go ask for the money. All they can do is say no. Just go ask for it, or watch those recorded sessions after the fact. There are a number of ways to participate, but just sitting back and saying, oh, it's too much of a hassle, it's too much work, it costs too much money, there really isn't an excuse in this day and age to better collaborate across multiple environments.
Okay, we have 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Agreed. I will also say, and it might not be a popular opinion, but kind of gone are the days of it not costing to do business with the government. I think that when you're thinking about collaboration, one is the education piece, which is a lot of what you're talking about, sharing best practices, what have you. But the other thing is really understanding from an open source standpoint, from a hardware services standpoint, what are you using that partnership to do, and making sure that we agree to the framework, because I don't think you can collaborate unless you're speaking the same language.
Thank you so much. And do we have time for no, we don't. Just kidding. Hot questions, quick.
Well, can you guys just hang here? We could just go to our break, and then if anybody's got questions, just come visit you guys. Would that
Yeah,
be okay?
all right, that sounds great.
Yeah. So thank you all. Thank
I want
you
to
so
thank
much.
Yeah,
That was,
thank you guys so much.
that was.
I really appreciate it.
You kept answering the questions, though. That's great. So please.